What a series of events for the Borderlands name, huh? A movie comes out only to receive mass hatred, and then a week later, Borderlands 4 is announced. An exciting and unexpected announcement, albeit soured slightly from the movie's poor reception. Nevertheless, Borderlands is all about the games, and so I've decided to go back and play them to see what they're really like in 2024. And hopefully by the end, it'll be a bit clearer what Borderlands 4 needs to nail in order to be successful. Starting out this journey, I attempted to play Borderlands 1, but wow, what an experience. Crashes, lags, poor load times, everything you want your game to not do, Borderlands 1 did. It's really unpleasant to play. I've played it dozens of times, and the biggest thing that the original Borderlands does right is its world. It's dusty, it's post-apocalyptic, it's brown, the character building is poor, and you'll have most talents by max level. In all ways, Borderlands 1 laid the groundwork. It's still fun today, but it's simple, it's missing a lot of quality of life features, and its story is not great despite the characters being so. Again, the groundwork. There's a spark of magic here, but the original Borderlands walks, so the next title can run. Borderlands 2. Now, there's a lot to the second Borderlands content-wise. There's 4 major DLCs, 5 if you count the newest one, Lilith and the Fight for Sanctuary, 2 character packs, Digistruct Peak, and a handful of smaller DLCs, most of which are themed around a real-life holiday. Thankfully, the most widely available way to purchase Borderlands 2 includes all of this. In an attempt to organize this discussion, I'd like to break this up into 4 sections: the campaigns, character customization, loot, and finally, endgame. This should cover most of the main features of the game, as well as give a bit of structure when I inevitably get to the other titles in the series. The base game of Borderlands 2 introduces Handsome Jack, and get used to seeing this guy because he is everywhere, and where he isn't, he's talked about. Yes, unfortunately, Handsome Jack is a bit like a minion in the sense that we just can't get rid of him. Admittedly, his appeal does last longer than that of a minion, but gave me an excuse to make that comparison, so I took it. But if we ignore that Jack has been beaten to death both literally and figuratively, he still is a great villain. He's charismatic, he's funny, he has great one-liners, and overall he's just a fantastic bad guy. You hate him because he's evil, he does awful things, but you also can't help but love him because he's such a good villain. And the great character writing doesn't stop with Jack. In fact, Borderlands 2 has some of the best iterations of both returning characters and new characters. Scooter is one of my all-time favorites, but now in Borderlands 2 you get to meet his sister, Ellie, who looks like this. The way Ellie fits into the game is incredible, figuratively, not literally. I don't know what she fits into literally. She does basically the same thing as Scooter, that being a mechanic, but she's not a copy of Scooter. She has her own jokes, she has her own quest, she's a fully fledged character, but she doesn't replace Scooter. She simply fits into the roster of characters as another great one. And don't think I've forgotten about the other huge addition to the gang, Tiny Tina.
These fine-ass women could stop that train for us, but I'm gonna need their badonkadonks first, and they got stolen by the bandits a few days ago. Go get them!
I know Tina can be odd.
Tina is such an iconic character. She's absolutely insane, but she doesn't push beyond her own limits. Look, this is all subjective, obviously, but to me personally, Tina rides the line of annoying sometimes, but rarely crosses it. Her jokes are played just far enough without pushing into constant jabbering and annoyance. She's a great addition, just like Ellie, and I think the game is better having both of them. Now, I haven't actually talked about the core plot of Borderlands 2, and honestly that's because the plot is okay. It's serviceable. The plot in each Borderlands is pretty much the same. Find the vault, open the vault, get paid. That's it. There's really nothing else. That's always the goal. But that's okay, because the focus is instead on the characters and their writing, which I think is where Borderlands is truly its best. Where the characters feel odd is where you have returning playable characters now as non-player characters. They instead take the reins and give out story quests, pushing the overall plot forward. I've always been torn on this. On the one hand, they are still well written and acted, they still have funny things to say, and they serve their purpose well. On the other hand, it's very weird to see what was essentially you in the last game now giving out quests and having fully voiced conversations. Every playable character in Borderlands 1 is here in Borderlands 2 as a standalone character. This is a trend that we'll see going forward, where playable characters here from Borderlands 2 will be returning in the third title to give out quests and whatnot. I don't mind it here, I think it's done pretty well, but towards some of the later DLCs, it can start to feel like the Borderlands 1 crew is still the main characters, whereas you feel like a side character, a spectator. Speaking of DLCs, Captain Scarlet and the Pirate's Booty is the first one, followed by Mr. Torg's Campaign of Carnage. Both of these are solid additions and totally worth playing. I know some folks don't like Mr. Torg's loud, yelling nature, but I really like him. Like Tiny Tina, he rides the line of being too much, but never crosses it for me. Right as I get tired of listening to him, he stops talking. Again, very subjective, but ultimately it works for me personally. Captain Scarlet is a similarly good DLC, albeit without any real memorable character additions. The humor is still here, and it mostly still works, but none of the characters here will really stick with you. The third DLC is Hammerlock's Big Game Hunt. This one is another great DLC, but I will say I'm not personally as big on the theme. Hammerlock is cool, and going on a wacky hunting trip with him is neat. I just didn't find the setting to be as fun as Pirates or Explosive NASCAR. Finally, there's Tiny Tina's Assault on Dragon Keep. If you've seen any DLC from Borderlands, you've seen this one. They even sell this DLC as a standalone title. You can buy and play this DLC without actually owning Borderlands 2. That's how popular this one is. That being said, I don't know what I can say that you haven't already heard about this DLC before. It's amazing, it's incredible, and I'm convinced it drove a lot of the design decisions for Borderlands 3, but that's Borderlands 3, a topic for another day. Assault on Dragon Keep is an incredible DLC that perfectly showcases why Borderlands DLCs are, as a whole, so coveted. It's fun, it's wacky, it adds a ton of new loot, and has some of the best character interactions in the whole series. All the add-ons in the Borderlands series are fun romps. They don't often push the main story of the Borderlands universe forward, instead they opt for a more fun and wacky side adventure. They are all successful in that regard. Some obviously do it better than others, but they're all worthwhile additions, and it's safe to say that if you like the base game, you'll like the DLCs since it's just more Borderlands. There are 5 playable characters in Borderlands 2, and they're all very different from one another, while also being very similar to one another. What I mean by that is that each character has their own action skill, passive abilities, and even some have melee skills you can get. That is where they're different. Where they're the same is that they all shoot guns. Well, I guess Krieg mostly punches, but you get what I mean. I bring this up because while you're mostly doing the same thing over and over again with any given character, they all somehow feel very unique and different to each other. They all play pretty much the same way: push the left bumper to activate your ability, pull the right trigger to shoot. It's that simple, but at the same time, it's not that simple. Borderlands has this way of taking a simple concept, shooting guns, and making it more than just shooting guns. There's accuracy, handling, elemental damage, status effects, non-elemental damage, action skill effects, melee damage, and a ton of other stats to drool over and make better. Like a more typical action RPG like, Diablo, there's a ton of ways to build your talent tree, and each one has small passive bonuses and bigger skill-changing and build-defining perks. Take my favorite character, the Mechromancer. She has 3 trees, one dedicated to her action skill robot companion, Deathtrap, one for shock damage and other elemental damage, and her final tree is her Anarchy tree, where you can build up bigger and bigger gun damage bonuses at the cost of accuracy. Invest in her Ricochet skill and suddenly the loss of accuracy isn't such a big deal. Walking around with 400 stacks of Anarchy, completely ruining any concept of hitting your target, the floor is now your best friend, and will now redirect those pesky bullets to the heads of unsuspecting bandits. This is just one piece of one character, and like I said, there's 5 of them. The possibilities may not be endless, but each class brings something fun and unique to the table, even if you are still just shooting guns. But I've been tiptoeing around long enough. Let's dig into what makes Borderlands, Borderlands. The loot. Loot is broken down into colored rarities, as is par for the course for any loot system. From worst to best, you've got wacky whites, goopy greens, bombastic blues, pleasing purples, magnificent magentas, and then you move on to the big ones. Oranges being lusty legendaries, pinks being satisfactory seraphs, teals being perfect pearlescents, and rainbows being excellent effervescence. Really exhausted my adjectives with that one. Now, the oranges and above usually have some sort of special effect. Not often is that effect listed though. So it is really exciting to find a new legendary you haven't seen yet, since you don't know how good it is until you actually shoot the thing. Loot is everywhere, but good loot is not so common. You get 8 slots to fill. 4 weapons, a grenade mod, a class mod, a shield, and finally an artifact. The weapons, obviously, are just guns. The grenade mod will change how your grenade functions, and honestly some of my favorite items are grenade mods. Like these magic grenades that you get from one of the add-ons. My favorite throws out a lightning bolt that bounces between enemies. Class mods are pretty important as they often pull a character together. They give some basic bonuses like shield capacity or extra damage with a certain weapon type, but beyond that they give extra points towards some of your skills. This can take a skill that you can only invest 5 points in and take it up to 9, 10, amping up the effects from that skill. It makes finding a good class mod exciting. When you find one that boosts some of your favorite skills, it allows you to double down on your specific setup. Keep an eye out for these things, and it's not just the orange ones you'll want to try. Shields do what you'd expect. They shield you from damage, but here in Borderlands 2 they actually do a lot more than that. Some shields absorb bullets, others retaliate against melee attackers, some explode when they break. There's a lot of them, and a lot of different effects that you can get on them. Finally, artifacts are kinda like another class mod, though not class specific. So unlike class mods, artifacts can be used on any character. Now these don't give you skill buffs, instead they're more akin to the general bonuses that you'll find on the class mod. Extra elemental damage, extra cooldown reduction, stuff like that. They're new to Borderlands 2 and it does kinda show. The artifacts aren't the most impressive additions, but they do add another way to strengthen your character, so in that regard they're good enough. But nothing is perfect, and there's no better example than that than the second Borderlands endgame. So it all starts when you finish the campaign. You beat the boss, you get the credits, and you do it all over again, with higher level enemies and better loot. Then you do it again. 3 total playthroughs. Normal, True Vault Hunter, and Ultimate Vault Hunter mode. You could say the real endgame begins after your 3rd playthrough, after you unlock the locations and start the sweet loot hunting. Loot in Borderlands is kinda annoying to get your hands on. There's a wide range of gear, tons of items to get, but to get specific items you'll have to hunt down specific bosses. That doesn't sound bad, but some of the bosses they want you to take down for some of these items are kinda obscure. Let's talk about one in particular, an item that you simply need in order to defeat some bosses. The bee. You get the bee from this random guy from this random mission. Sure, he's technically named, so he does seem a little bit important, but this guy is by far the most important boss to farm in the game. Loot Lemon, which is a Borderlands companion website, states that there are a couple of other places to get the bee, but again, the game doesn't tell you any of this. The bee is an amp shield, which means that when it's fully charged, it will boost the damage of your next shot at the cost of some damage to the shield. But the bee's shield cost for that extra damage is 0. Meaning that if you have full shields, you're dealing more damage with every shot. The bee is only one half of why I think Borderlands 2's endgame suffers so. The other half is slag. Slag is a new element in Borderlands 2, and when applied to an enemy, it causes them to take increased damage from sources other than slag. It's kinda cool, a little debuff that you can apply to enemies to get a bit more damage across the board. Slag starts out fine. In your first couple of playthroughs, you won't even need to worry about it. But by the time you reach your 3rd playthrough, Ultimate Vault Hunter mode, slag is basically a necessity. As you move up in playthroughs and thus difficulty, slag becomes more and more potent, and enemies similarly become more and more tanky. It gets to a point where if you don't have an enemy slag, they're almost not even worth shooting. Combine this with the bee, and now you've got yourself a meta. On top of this, there are certain weapons that can apply the bee's full damage with multiple projectiles from a single shot, which of course puts some limitations on what kind of weapons you'd want to use. Not all weapons are created equal. Some weapons just kinda suck, even legendaries. And now having certain weapons work better with the bee than others, combined with everything else, makes Borderlands 2's endgame feel very limiting. But okay, so there's a pretty strictly defined meta, but what about the actual activities you'll be doing in the endgame? They're pretty solid. It mostly boils down to fighting bosses and the raid on Digistruct Peak. It doesn't sound like much, and it isn't, but you don't really need much. The enemies scale up to you on the third playthrough, so technically the entire game is endgame. Doing side quests, main quests, DLC quests, it's all pretty much endgame once you reach max level. But okay, back on track. Bosses. There's raid bosses, which house some light mechanics that pushes them above being just a bigger enemy to shoot. They're all pretty fun to fight. I'm not going to go through all of them, but there's quite a few, and they're really fun to fight with friends, so if you've got those, good for you. The raid on Digistruct Peak is the main endgame though. It's a little arena you go through, and once you finish, you get access to overpower levels. You select an overpower level once you hit play, and all this does really is increase the enemy difficulty, but the loot you get is also overpowered, which just makes the numbers bigger pretty much. This I'm torn on, because what this means is that you're going to have to farm the same items over and over again in order to keep up with the enemies. That level 80B isn't going to hit nearly as hard as the OP5 or OP10B. So it's kind of an empty farm. You're farming just to farm at that point. On the other hand, you can use the overpowered gear in the normal game, which does in fact alleviate a lot of the meta, since now your weapons can simply deal more damage, reducing the need for both slag and the B. I don't know, for me it's 50-50. I feel like for every cool part of the endgame, there's something I really don't like. I like that Digistruct Peak unlocks more and more as you go higher into the overpowered levels, but I don't like the over-reliance of slag and very specific items. It's a toss-up, and I think as a whole it does work and is fun, but I find myself a bit frustrated at the lack of variety in the endgame. So, Borderlands 2 in 2024. It's still a great game. Most of my complaints are directed at the endgame, which honestly I don't think most people will stick around for. Going from level 1 to 80 is a pretty long process, and there's 5 characters, so you could seriously see a couple hundred hours of gameplay before you even touch the true last bits of the game. On the flip side of that, characters are easy to import and edit, so if you want, you can just boost up characters. Which I love, since if you want to grind really hard, you can. If you don't want to grind, you don't have to. It's important to remember just what kind of game Borderlands 2 is. It's not a live service game. You're not going to miss out on anything. You can play it offline. You can play a co-op. You can mod your characters. You can grind for hours on end. It's really all about you. Borderlands 2 is often dirt cheap. If you're looking digital, obviously, wait for a sale. You can usually pick it up for around 20 USD, and you can often get it bundled with some of the other games in the series as well. Like the pre-sequel, which, isn't great, but it's worth a playthrough or two. Borderlands 2 is fantastic. The negative things I have to say about the game is coming from someone with hundreds and hundreds of hours in the game. Back on my PlayStation 3, I spent a ludicrous amount of time just enjoying the game, and it's still fun today. It's a timeless classic, a brilliant display of what a first-person shooter could do with a more RPG style. It's fun, it's cheap, it's co-op, and it has dozens and dozens of hours of fun and replayable content. But those are just my thoughts, and I'm sure you all are eager to share yours as well, so please do. Let's talk Borderlands down in the comments. How do you all think this game holds up today? Until next time.